We are all living longer, living healthier, living with chronic illness and all of the things that come with it. And we're also experiencing a lot of loss. It's part of living and going through your life, and having a long life also means that you've experienced quite a bit of loss.
There's 10 to 20% of people who actually really struggle with it. And those are the people that we want to keep an eye out for. And those are the people that we want to sort of be tuned into some issues. So one of the things that we can do to help ourselves and others is to watch for some of the signs of grief moving into depression.
Right.
So sadness is normal, and sadness looks like depression a little bit sometimes, except the difference between grief and sadness is that, and depression, or sadness and depression, is that depression will be chronic, it will stay low, and it won't bounce up. Someone, let's just say, Bob loses his wife, and he feels really low and depressed.
Yeah.
But then he goes to see his grandkids, and he has a wonderful afternoon with them, kind of forgets a little bit that how sad he is that he's lost his wife. But then when he goes home, his mood drops again. That's classic grief, where you bounce up and you come down, and you bounce up and you come down. In depression, the flatness stays. You'd go see the grandkids, but you wouldn't feel any joy in that. You might not feel any sense of pleasure or even excitement to see them. And you might feel pulled in, withdrawn, a little dissociated. So one of the things that we can do is watch for when our moods are getting a little bit chronically trapped and a little bit chronically sort of stuck in the stickiness of loss after about 6 months. 6 months is the point when if someone really isn't like seeing that their mood can fluctuate and breathe a little bit more. Ups and downs are very, very normal in grief. Feeling times of life and hope and future orientation, and feeling like you can see a way forward, you'll be okay, you love the person and you can remember them and think about their face without dropping away. But then there's periods of sorrow, hopelessness, and feeling lost and in denial that life will ever be okay. So that's a very natural flow up and down, Colleen. But if people get stuck downstairs, and we see that going on after 6 months for longer than a couple of weeks or a couple of months, then I would start to ask some questions like do you feel like you're ever going to be happy? Are you feeling any feelings of hopelessness, like not being alive, like just rather maybe not be alive? Just carefully checking out what the level of their despair is.
Okay, Roy, we've talked a lot about how grief can impact someone and what normal grief looks like. And if I am somebody who's watching this today and I've come here because I am grieving and it's 3 months or 4 months past the time that I've lost someone, and I'm wondering, how can I get through this piece of it? There is an acceptance that we talked about, it is going to be sad, but how do we get through? How do we find moments of light or moments to breathe?
Well, first of all, we need other people. And there is sort of a rugged individualism that's rampant in our society that says, just be quiet, don't burden other people, smile. This is a classic for seniors. Smile and just, don't let on how hurting you are. This usually doesn't go very well. Given that 45% of women over the age of 65 are widowed, we know that there's just so many people that are grieving. So many people have loss in their life. A death has happened to them either recently or is in the process of happening. So we should be able to find people like us. So the first really important thing is find people to talk to about this. That might be your daughter or your son. It could be your friend. Or it could be like going to a group, a support group, either finding one online. It's harder these days with COVID to find a real one, which is really a really big loss for our culture. It's something we should try and fix. But there are groups to be found out there. There's one at Hospice Halifax, I think here. I run grief groups from time to time as well, and they are around. But finding other people, grief is a group undertaking. It's best done in crowds. It's best done with other people. So one of the most powerful things and most helpful things and most practical things that you can do is find people to talk to who will listen to you and pay attention and see you, so that you can say what you need to say, really speak of your deep feelings, to touch in that there's deep sadness here. And we're not a culture that likes to see sadness. We don't mind sadness for a couple weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks.
Right.
But if you're 2 months out, still brokenhearted and having a hard time getting out of bed, this is not a culture that makes room for that. So you're going to need to find special people who can really listen. And that might not be your family. So that's one thing I think that's really important, is just to kind of right off the bat know that you can't and shouldn't do this alone. That also might look like professional help, like a counselor or a therapist, but it could also be your minister or some other like life coach. There's lots of different people, and there's also people that are specializing in grief now, that are sort of grief specialists that you can talk to. I think that's the number one practical thing, is to find someone. Secondly is to take care of the basics.
Right.
The basics are so important, and the basics are easy to drop away when we're grieving. Diet, when we're full of separation anxiety and separation distress, which is what grief is. The stress of grief is the number one stressor for human beings on the stress index scale is loss of a spouse. So that tells us that any senior who's lost a spouse, especially, but this could be true of a friend as well, is at the highest level experiencing the worst stress that they can experience, and that's going to have strong impacts on their health, on their physical well-being, on their immune system, on their mental health, on their concentration, on their ability just to feel well all around. So concentrating on the basics is really important. Are you getting enough food? Are you feeding yourself? There's so many seniors that lose weight after they lose somebody, and they lose a lot of weight, and they come in and they say, I've lost 20 pounds since John died. Well, of course, so some of that's okay, but we have to pay attention to the fact that we need to get the food in the body needs the food, the brain needs the food to do the work that it needs to do. If we're starving our body of food, it's going to be harder for us to grieve. We're going to have a harder time managing our emotions because we're putting our body in another stress.
Right.
We need to try and sleep. And if you're having trouble sleeping, there are sleep aids. Sleep is really like job one. If you're not getting enough sleep, everything else cascades. The dominoes fall. Sleep is king. So get enough sleep as much as you can. Seniors don't sleep well anyway. Right. The older I get, the worse my sleep is. My poor mother has a terrible time sleeping. 4 a.m. is like, she's up and around and playing solitaire and watching TV. So finding ways to rejuvenate and to restore through sleep and through naps. Some people are really against naps, but just napping and just following the natural rhythms of what the body is saying it needs. Sleeping is really important. And then, of course, walking with other people, with your pet, or getting a pet if you haven't had a pet. Pets are have proven, research shows that pets help people grieve and help that 10 to 20% of people that struggle with grief. 80% of people don't struggle with grief, but for that 10 to 20% of people who do, pets are magic. Either being around a friend's pet regularly, or getting your own pet, or volunteering to be around pets. So pets are powerful, and walking and being outside, being in nature, moving your body and getting some exercise gets us out of the house, especially if you're in the house where the person died, or where you lived with them. It can be very difficult to keep returning to that place over and over again. It reminds you of the death and of what you don't have and of the absence. And so getting out of that context and taking breaks from it and going to the mall and going to be with your friends and pushing yourself just a little bit, just a little bit, Colleen, because we don't want to be heroic.
No.
Right.
Right.
We want to just invite people to just push a little bit out of their comfort zone when they feel like they just want to stay home and not go to church this Sunday. I don't want one more person to ask me about, dope. Well, if we don't take some risks and extend ourselves a little bit into the world, we're taking more risk to actually sort of become chronic and stuck. And it's quite common for seniors to sort of get locked in at home. Then they don't move as much. Then their bodies are not as well, and they get sick more. Immune system will come down. Taking vitamins and watching also on eating good food, not just eating, but eating good food and making sure you're restoring that way. Those are really important things to be done, to do. Lots of people feel that it's important to either volunteer or at some point do some things that are different and that are life-focused and that aren't grief-focused. Most people actually naturally do that. Most people kind of want to go see their grandkids, be around their friends, go play cards, do some of the things that they like doing. But I think it's also important to say that it's okay for people to change their patterns. One of the real practical things that people can do is actually make a deal with themselves that if they don't want to do something that they used to do, if they want to do something new, that's okay.
They can do it. It's a new chapter.
It's a new chapter. And even if they don't want it to be a new chapter, that transition of saying, I used to, my husband used to mow the lawn, but I'm gonna mow the lawn.
I'm gonna learn how. Yeah.
Right. That's a step, but that's also saying he's not here anymore. So these are really powerful when we do new things and try new things on and give ourselves permission to do the new, and to try new things on for size, even when they're kind of scary for us. So to let our patterns change. You might not want to do Christmas one year. You might want to just say, this year, I'm not putting up stuff. I'm not going to do the big decorations. I'm not putting up a tree this year. I just don't feel like it. I'm not going to celebrate his birthday or her birthday. I just don't feel like it this year.
Right.
To allow yourself to do what you feel is right and to really trust those instincts, because there's a lot of pressure on seniors to, let's just
be stoic.
Right. We've always done this. Let's do it again.
Right.
As opposed to say, this just doesn't feel right. It's too much for me.
Yeah.
I need to do something different. I can't do it the same way.
One of the purposes of today's discussion is to help people become better at this. We talked about how society doesn't really want to talk about grief. And I shared a story with you earlier about how I was in a coffee shop one time talking about the work that I do, and the person at the next table got up and left and said that grief and talking about death, even though it wasn't anything specific, it was more from an academic perspective, didn't want to hear about that in the coffee shop. And so how can we get better at this in our communities and where we live? And what can we do collectively to get better at this?
The answer's tough, a little bit. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to be willing to be a bit more uncomfortable than we've been. The reason why we're not having these conversations, Colleen, is because they're uncomfortable conversations. They're bumpy, they're lumpy, they make us feel vulnerable, they make us feel mortal. And I think that by not having these conversations, we spare ourselves that discomfort and that awkwardness and that anxiety. But as a result of that, then when moments like when real grieving moments come, we don't know what to do, or when someone's dying, we don't know how to engage, or just having those really plain spoken conversations. Mom, this prognosis isn't good. We don't know how long you have. We're all aware right now that we're just in some limbo, and that feels weird to us all. That's an important conversation to have, right? To say what isn't, to be able to talk about things that aren't clear, to be able to talk about things that aren't solid, that are ambiguous, right? Because grief and death and dying is really mysterious, ambiguous stuff. And all of our need for concretization and give me the prognosis, give me the date, that doesn't work when it comes to grief, death, and dying. So learning to have ambiguous, sort of airy, foggy conversations about stuff that we can't fully pin down, but that gives us all kinds of feelings is really important. And that's not easy for any of us, any family, or any couple. So I think leaning in a little bit into these uncomfortable conversations and taking some risks to fumble our way together into the most important stuff. Because behind all this is just I care for you. I love you. I want to be able to watch over you and watch over what's happening to all of us with awareness and presence.
Yeah.
And so that's why we ask these questions. Otherwise, we're all backed off and everyone's just kind of standing a little bit aloof and just seeing what happens. And for the person who's dying, it just becomes a desert of loneliness. And isolation and loneliness, both in the dying process, in dying itself, and in grief. Isolation and loneliness are the killers. As is not being touched a lot. So I would add to also touch people, to hug them a long time. We know that a hug that goes on for about 30 to 60 seconds actually triggers our survival physiology, our polyvagal nerve, to calm and relax and to feel like oxytocin, which is the sort of the love chemical that babies and mothers trade in. Those big hugs calm us, and so touching each other, looking in each other's eyes, being silent together, crying together, sitting beside each other, and just being with, without doing things, Colleen, just to be with in that mysterious, unknown place which grief and death and dying brings us to, where we don't really feel like we have solid ground. I think that's really important. And touch is super, super crucial.
Thanks, Roy, so much for having this conversation with me today. You've talked a lot and given us a lot of information and a lot of things to digest, but where can we point people if they're looking for more resources to help support either themselves or those they love through this period of grief and bereavement?
Yeah, there's lots of great online resources for people. I would start probably with in Nova Scotia with the Nova Scotia Hospice Palliative Care Association. Obviously, you guys have a great website. There's the Canadian Virtual Hospice, which can be found easily online, Canadian Virtual Hospice. And then Refuge in Grief is another really wonderful website which has lots of information about grief and loss. And there's another one called Modern Grief, Modern Loss. And it's another good website that's accessible. And I really encourage people to go to Chapters or go on to Amazon. I like to go to Chapters. They have a really big grief section. I just tell them to go in, pull a couple things out, sit down in a chair, and see what speaks to them. Some people like narrative, some people like stories, and some people like more like non-fiction, like tell me, self-helpy, and other people like more poetic and journals and things. So there's lots of different options. So I encourage people to do some bibliotherapy if they're interested in that. And oftentimes churches and different organizations will also have grief groups and things like that. And sometimes you can find that out by going online and sort of searching a little bit for some resources.
Well, thanks, Roy, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. And thank you for the work that you do. Once again, we'd like to thank our funder, the Canadian government's No Horizons for Seniors program, and most importantly, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, regardless of where you are. We hope that this information you have found helpful. I hope that you will be able to treat yourself if you are grieving with care and compassion and have a better understanding of the experience of grief and loss. If you are looking for more information and are uncertain as to where to start, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Nova Scotia Hospice Palliative Care Association, www.nshpca.ca, and someone will be able to direct you as to what your next step should be. Take good care.